Good evening, everybody. I'm Dan Douglas from the English Department and the Applied Linguistics Program and the Linguistics Program. And I'm here to welcome you all to the Quinton Johnson Memorial Lecture. The annual Linguistics Lecture started in 1978, 30 years ago. Some of us were just toddlers when that started. The newly organized Linguistics Program Committee decided to give the Linguistics Program greater visibility and instituted the lecture. The first lecture was given by Professor Frederick Cassidy of the University of Wisconsin and a participant in the Dictionary of American English project. The Linguistics Program Committee named the series after Professor Quinton Johnson, a respected teacher of English and linguistics, shortly after his death in 1986 at the age of 56. Quinton received his PhD in English in 1967 from the University of Oregon. His dissertation studied the translation of the Aeneid into Scots by the medieval Scottish poet Gavin Douglas, interestingly enough. Quinton taught at Iowa State from 1956 to 1958 and again from 1961 to 1986. His teaching responsibilities range from technical writing to linguistics to Chaucer to freshman composition. At different moments in his career, he chaired the technical writing program, the freshman English program, and the English graduate program. Although Chaucer was his favorite subject, Quinton had a long-standing interest in historical linguistics and the study of American dialects. Together with other faculty from English and world languages and cultures, Quinton founded the Interdisciplinary Linguistics Program in 1978. His pioneering efforts paved the way for what is currently the Cross-Disciplinary Linguistics Program, with over 15 contributing faculty from at least 6 different departments and currently enjoying 40 majors. Now I'll hand over to Barb, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm very delighted tonight to introduce our speaker for this year's Quinton Johnson Lecture. Dr. Dan Everett currently serves as chair of the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at Illinois State University. And before he went to that other ISU, he taught at the University of Manchester in England, where he served as a research professor and chair of phonetics and phonology in the Department of Linguistics. Before working at the University of Manchester, Dr. Everett taught at the University of Pittsburgh and at MIT. Dr. Everett is here tonight to talk about his work with the Amazon Basin's Pirara people and their language. Dr. Everett has lived in the jungle villages for more than 7 years of his life and has been conducting research in these villages every year since 1977. Dr. Everett began his research with this language when he traveled to Brazil to do missionary work. Part of the training for this work involved enrolling in the Summer Institute of Linguistics, which trains missionaries to learn languages quickly. And according to Wikipedia, which I'm sure is never wrong, people before him had failed in learning the language, and he was successful in having done so. It's quite a feat. In the fall of 1978, Dr. Everett enrolled at the State University of Campinas in Brazil to continue his work on the study of this language, and he focused, of course, on the theories of Noam Chomsky. And his PhD dissertation dealt with a Chomskyan analysis of the language. So our presentation tonight is very exciting because his work has been a bit controversial in the field of linguistics, so we are on the cutting edge of changes that may be happening and how we think about language. And I also wanted to alert you, Dr. Everett has a new book out, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, Life and Language in the Amazonian Jungle. It's to be released November 11th, so it's coming up. I would pre-order your copy. Reviews have been very favorable. Might be hard to find in bookstores once it's released. This book is not only a book about his research, but from what I read from previews, a bit of an adventure story and a fascinating memoir of a life that has been affected by exposure to such a unique culture. So adding to these reviews, also wanted to mention that his book was selected by the BBC Book of the Week Club. So in November, I don't know if any of you shortwave radio or what, but so hopefully would soon be repeated here in the States. His book will be read in Britain Monday through Friday for that week, and with an estimated audience of about 3 million listeners. So it's definitely going to have wide exposure. But tonight we have an opportunity to get a little preview of some of this information that will be appearing in the book that will soon to come out. So please welcome Dr. Dan Everett. Dan?
Thanks. It's really great to be here. It's quite an honor. Peter Han would say something like, so that's speak Peter Han. Peter Han is a pretty language. I like everyone here. I just threw that in as a tag. All the photos and the presentation are the work of New Yorker photographer Martin Scholler, who's a very good photographer. I was telling someone that these photos might look simple, but for every photo there were lights all around, and he flew in with a plane load of equipment and an assistant, and I had to be in the water for about an hour there. What this presentation is about primarily is the nature of human language. One of the arguments that language is innately specified in the genes, in the human genome, is the fact that it's ubiquitous. It's found with many similar characteristics across the 6,500. There are 6,500 mutually unintelligible languages in the world. So across the world, we find that every human speaks a language. These languages are moderately close in levels of complexity, according to some hypotheses. Their languages share a number of similarities. Children learn language with an amazing degree of demonstrated ability in a short amount of time with quite a level of accuracy. But I want to make the case that evidence from Peter Han and evidence from other languages suggests that language is really not something we need to call innately specified as part of the genes, but it is in fact more closely akin to tools that we find ubiquitous in human culture. One such tool is fire. Every human culture has fire. Fire plays an important role in human society, and there's no need to propose a gene for fires. Other things that seem to be almost universal are arrows and pizza. Most cultures have arrows. I was in the Xingu Park region with another group called the Suya, you may have seen them. They have large plates in their lower lips, and they had this thing on the fire that was manioc bread round with meat on top, and I asked them, what's that? And they said, pizza. They speak Portuguese, unlike the Piraha, and they said, that's our pizza. Well, pizza is fairly ubiquitous, although the Piraha don't have it. So what makes these things ubiquitous? And I want to claim that it's because they fulfill a role as cultural tools. So there is a plug. This on the left is the American cover, and on the right is the British cover. And The Pitaha have gotten publicity from the weirdest places. This Italian style magazine actually had a story about the Pitaha Flair, and it's been in very unusual magazines. I've never been able to completely figure out why people are so interested in some aspects of the story. I don't know why they never showed me the magazine except to interview me. So I don't know if they had a story on recursion in this magazine or not, but. The Pitaha probably were as large as 50,000 people in the 1700s. Today there are roughly 350 spread out across the Meissei River. So if you took out all the country boundaries of South America, they would be right in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It's a language unrelated to any other known language. It doesn't belong to any known linguistic family. There's no other language that has words in common with it, or it just seems to be quite different. Nobody knows where it came from, but we know that given the rate that languages change, we're probably talking about breaking off from any other language as much as 3,000 years ago. Arriving in the Pitaha is easier today than it was when I first started. Now I can fly in, and the pilot is my son-in-law. So what used to take me a week to get into the village now takes an hour and a half from the nearest city on a pontoon plane. It takes time to figure out things in these languages. This little boy is my son, who's starting his second year as assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Miami. And I've been pondering these problems since he was a year old. So it's been going, actually, I think he was 6 months old when I started thinking about these issues. So nothing I'm going to tell you today is the result of some magical insight I had after my first 3 weeks in the village. I've worked on this language since I was 26, and I'm not 26 now. Actually, I'm a lot older than 26. Anyway, I published the material that has attracted so much attention in 2005. This is a spirit. It's quite common in the evenings for the Pitaha to claim that spirits are speaking to them from the jungle. So you hear these high falsetto voices. And this is a Pitaha man who claims to be a spirit at the time. And just a few more images of the Pitaha people. This picture is of the oldest man in the village where I spend most of my time. His name is Toi Toi. He's probably 70 and still quite a fisherman. You can see the length of their arrows. That's a fishing arrow, so it doesn't have feathers, and it's longer, so it floats when you hit a fish. And the bow, he's about 5 foot tall, 5'1", and the bow is probably 7 feet tall. This is Pepayo. She is a very funny person, always laughing, has 2 small boys, and her husband's picture's in here, I think. No, that's not her husband. That's Kayapa, and he's just a squirrely teenager, like teenagers are. That's one thing that does seem to be universal about the world, is when they get to be a certain age, they run around and make noise and do practical jokes and make fun of old people. This is Ka'awe, and he's been my friend ever since 77. I've known him most of my life. What do the Pitahas have to teach us? Well, again, one hears of language as innate or as instinctual so frequently these days that it might be surprising to hear that there are many researchers who think that it is nothing of the kind. There are various alternative views of the nature of human language. And in my opinion, language rests on 6 preconditions: the platform, society, intentionality, cognition, culture, and communication. Once these conditions are met, language emerges naturally, to be shaped like a tool by the culture in which it develops. Like a tool, it can vary widely. parts of it can be lost, and it fits the needs of its own culture better than it fits the needs of other cultures. So what are these preconditions again? The platform is just the biological apparatus that allows us to have language as human beings. It includes our vocal apparatus. Interestingly enough, there's not a single part of the human vocal apparatus that is exclusively dedicated to language. Just as, in fact, contrary to what many people think, there's really nothing really known in the brain that's exclusively dedicated to language. Part of the platform is a brain that has the ability to serialize, to focus, to discriminate. Part of the platform are bodies of a certain type. There are a number of studies that suggest that only after hominids became bipedal and were able to look around and move around better were they able to develop some of the skills that underlie language. It's very important for us to be able to recognize certain kinds of task-central things. One of the most important things for humans to be able to recognize is the difference between things and events. So, mastodon kill is very important for us to hunt together. Presumably, one of the earliest functions of language was to hunt. Some people have suggested to sing. We don't really know. And anybody who tells you they know exactly how language originated obviously doesn't. We don't know. And we're not going to know at the end of this lecture. But I will tell you what I think. Intentionality. One of the most important cognitive abilities that we have as human beings, and something that's absolutely crucial to language, is the ability to talk about the world and to orient ourselves with respect to the world. Another term for intentionality is aboutness. So if I say I will kill and eat, I am saying that I can adapt the world to my mind. I have the thought of killing and eating, and I can make the world such that I do kill something and I do eat. My mind can also adapt to the world. It can also be about the world. I believe that that is a threatening animal. So there's something in the world and my mind is adapting to it. It's also important that we have individual versus group intentionality, that we be able to recognize that I have intentions, things that make my mind fit to the world or the world fit to my mind, but so do other people, and that together our minds can fit the world or make the world fit to us. And many studies have shown that the advent of language, the onset of language in human children, isn't some mysterious time that's sparked by the genes, but it really begins with the onset of the child's ability to recognize other human beings as distinct from other animals and as having minds like the child's. And the child's actually able to do this at about 9 months of age. Society is crucial to language. I don't want you to run in front of the best hunter. I agree not to steal your food. We agree to constrain our behaviors for one another. Society is the set of constraints that groups of people impose on one another. It makes it quite different from culture. But society is crucial to a human interaction. One of the things that the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau missed when he was talking about the social contract, and this is pointed out by John Searle, a philosopher at the University of California, Berkeley, that the first really fundamental social contract that underlies all other social contracts is our language. The fact that we're going to call that object a chair, and we're going to say that if I move quickly, I'm running. These are things that we, in a sense, agree on. The foundational, the people who developed English, whoever they were, and whenever that happened, the people who developed languages were developing a social contract, a series of agreements that certain things would stand for other things. Cognition is also important, the ability to think, but not just the ability to think in any old way. Our brains are much more than unordered sets of concepts. Our brains order and arrange hierarchically very important structural relationships among concepts. There are two interesting books out that are both out in the last 2 years. Philosopher Michael Devitt's book, Ignorance of Language. And in this book, he argues for the fact that language, the structure of language reflects the structure of thought. Thought came first. The structures of thought were imposed by the necessity of being able to think in a certain way, and those are reflected from time to time in languages. Most languages will have most of the structure of thought. But some people might think one way and yet keep their language simpler than the way they think. You can't ever make language more complex than the way you think, because the thinking underlies language. But you could have languages simpler than thought. At least that's part of the hypothesis, and that's my hypothesis. A counter-proposal is a recent work by Thomas Roper, The Prism of Grammar, in which he claims that without language we would have never been able to think. It's language that gives us the ability to think. I don't think that's right. I won't have time to rebut all of his arguments, or maybe any of them in here, so just let me say gratuitously that I think he's wrong. But it's a very interesting idea, and this is a chicken-egg problem. What came first, the ability to think, which reflected itself in the structure of language, or the ability to talk, which then reordered our thought process? Devitt, I think, makes a very good case in his book that thought must have preceded language. So we have grammar in the head and grammar in the language. And again, the question is, which came first? And then culture. Culture is, if society is the set of constraints that people share, culture is the way that a certain group of people, a certain community, gets meaning out of the world. How do we attach meaning? How do we interpret the world around us? So when I'm with the Piraha, and if I walk in the jungle and see a tree branch moving up and down, to me, that just means a tree branch moving up and down. But to the Piraha, the direction of the movement, whether other branches are moving, how far it moves, will indicate whether it's wind, whether it's an animal, what kind of animal it is, and they will immediately make a decision as to whether they should hunt or just keep going. They get more meaning out of certain things than I do, just as I get more meaning out of they do. So I've taken Piraha to the city, and as we're crossing a street, I get meaning out of the red light. And I don't step into the street, but if I don't tell them not to, they will step into the street, because they don't get the meaning out of the red light. How we get meaning out of the world, once again, is culture. And then communication. And by that I mean the mechanics of communication, such that it couldn't be any other way. We don't need a grammar to tell us that when we talk to one another, we take turns. Because if we talk at the same time, we're probably not going to hear each other. So it just is useful, in fact, incredibly useful, for each one of us to take turns talking. That imposes an order on things. It's very important that we be able to talk about objects and events. That's just part of what it means to be a group living in the world. We have to be able to distinguish objects and events. So it's not a surprise that almost all languages, if not all languages, have nouns and verbs. We have to have purpose in our speech. We have to have a sense of purpose and intentionality, and we have to be able to order things. I cannot utter all the words of a sentence at the same time. I don't have a parallel processing mouth. My mouth can only order things one word at a time. Even if my brain can think of all the words at once, and I doubt if it can, I can't say them all at once. So they have to come out in a certain order. Ordering is part of what grammar is, and so we need to ask ourselves from time to time, what else is there to grammar besides the ordering that the words come out? Why do they come out in a certain order and not in another order? It's also important to recognize, and now we're off the preliminary conditions, a distinction that a number of linguists and anthropologists have made between esoteric and exoteric societies. Esoteric societies tend to talk about a very narrow and highly expected range of topics. Not because they are too stupid to talk about anything else, but because their societal constraints and their cultural values limit conversation to a range of topics. Also, they're just their basic experience. If you live in the middle of the Amazon, you probably won't talk about nuclear physics. That doesn't mean you're not smart enough to talk about nuclear physics, but you've never had the training to talk about it, and you've never been exposed to it, so you probably wouldn't talk about it. Exoteric societies, on the other hand, have a much wider range of things they can talk about. They're probably part of the industrial world in some way, and they're used to dealing with people from lots of different societies. So the cultural values that narrow the range of experiences that are expected to be talked about are absent to some degree. So I was at I was at a large linguistic meeting many years ago, and the Christian linguist Kenneth Pike was asked to say the invocation, and he said, Lord, thanks for good food, good friends, and good things to talk about. And I added wine, because that's also really good to have. So there are just things that are pleasurable about humans that involve communication. We take a great deal of pleasure out of communication. I mean, for some reason, you all came here tonight to hear a communication and perhaps to participate because we in our society find it pleasurable. The Pitaha also find communication pleasurable. They just would never sit quiet for one person to talk. They don't have that cultural concept that one person should dominate the conversational space. But I'm glad that you do, and please don't all talk at once. If language is a tool, let's just assume for a second that language might be a tool. What would that mean? Does it have any predictions? Well, for one thing, we have to be clear on what we mean by tool, because my arm can be used as a tool, right? But it doesn't make much sense to call my arm only a tool, because the culture that I grow up in doesn't have any effect whatsoever on the fact that I grow an arm. It could have if I'm malnourished, my arm could be one way versus another. My culture could make my arm one shape or another based on the uses to which it's put. But basically, there's very little effect on my culture as to whether I grow an arm, which I can then use for a number of cultural purposes. But shovels, for example, or bows and arrows, or other tools, really do differ quite a bit according to the culture. Now, we've seen, the Pitaha bows and arrows are quite different from, say, the Banawa, which only live a few hundred miles away in the jungle. Banawa make bows and arrows that are very short, maybe 4 feet tall, and their arrows, if you saw a Banawa bow and arrow, you would think they had only made it for tourists. Nobody would hunt with these flimsy little things. The Pitaha bows and arrows are almost 8 feet long. Some of the arrows range from 6 feet to 10 feet. I actually have one that's probably 12 feet long. And so what's the difference here? Well, the Banawa make poison. They make curare. And they tip the ends of their arrows. They put on the arrow tips curare. They don't need the arrow to kill the animal. The poison's going to kill the animal in about 15 minutes. So they have these flimsy little arrows that have tips designed to break off inside. And so they shoot it, and the tip breaks off inside, and the guy goes jogging after it, and it's going to fall dead very quickly. It's very deadly poison. Pitaha don't have poison. The arrow does the killing. The impact of the arrow, so I've seen Pitaha men skewer wild pigs that goes in one end and out the other. They're very powerful with the bow. So these, although the bow and arrow follows it solves a common problem, how to kill protein that moves faster than you. It has a similar design because of the physics. But it has an enormous range of shapes based on the culture that it's found in. And that's what I want to claim language is like. Languages vary a lot more than we might have thought. They vary about as much as they could, given the physical and other limitations that we've been talking about. Much more than we might have otherwise been led to believe by the language as language's innate hypothesis. Some tools can be lost. I've heard it said that there are societies who've lost the ability to make fire. Okay, so are there peoples that have lost the ability to speak to one another? Probably not, on the one hand, because it's so crucial to our survival that although we could get by without fire, we probably couldn't get by without talking. But there might be a few cases where people have fairly minimal linguistic skills. So, for example, if you travel the Trans-Amazon Highway, one interesting fact is that you'll see a lot of the settlers are tall and blonde. And that most of them are either descended from Germans or they have just come over from Germany. Now, the ones who've just come over from Germany speak broken Portuguese often, but they speak fluent German. But the ones who are a German descendant, don't speak Portuguese very well, and they don't speak German very well. It's fascinating. They're sort of outcast in Brazilian society, many of them, and yet they're not German anymore either. And so I've talked to people that couldn't finish sentences. They just seem to have a difficult time producing sentences in any language. But they could talk, they could communicate, but their language skills might not have been equal to the language skills of others. That would be consistent with the language tool hypothesis. So what's the principal task of the language tool? If you believe that language precedes thought, then the principal task of language might be, as Chomsky has claimed, to help us express our thoughts. But if you believe that thought precedes language, then it seems pretty obvious that the principal function of language is to communicate. So it wouldn't be a surprise to you to tell me that the reason we have language is so we can talk to one another, as opposed to just think. People have taken a lot of different views on how language and cognition and culture relate. So one is that cognition constrains grammar entirely. And that's Chomsky's view, called universal grammar, or what Steve Pinker calls the language instinct, that we're born with this instinct, with this universal grammar that kicks on and kicks off according to biological program. Another view is that grammar constrains cognition. That was the view of Benjamin Lee Whorf, the Whorf hypothesis, who claims that the way we talk influences the way we think. So if we don't have words for time in our language, it's because not only do we not have words about time, but we'd be incapable of thinking about time very accurately. Another view is that cognition constrains culture. So Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, two friends of mine, former anthropologists from the University of California, Berkeley, have argued that all languages have color words and that the color words will always fall into predetermined sets. That's interesting. It's a universal claim, and it's based on the idea that cognition, or the structure of the brain more precisely, constrains culture. Another view is that grammar constrains culture. So Greg Urban, an anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania, has argued that in some societies, the passive voice is much more common than the active voice, which is true. And in societies where the stories are about people and they're almost always in the passive voice, these heroes, the heroes of these societies, are entities that have things done to them more than do things to other people. And societies which have texts that are mainly active voice, the heroes do things. And he's argued that this produces different concept of what a hero is in the two societies. Is it someone that's always having things happen to them, or someone that's always doing things to make things happen? Another view is that culture constrains cognition. And there's a lot of research in psychology and anthropology about the long-term effects of thinking of cultural restrictions on certain behaviors. So, for example, if you don't have any numbers, you're probably, and you never think about counting, well, let me rephrase that. If you don't have any need to count and you don't have any need for numbers, you probably aren't going to develop them. And then finally, which is the view that I'm talking about here, is culture constrains grammar. Now, what I want to claim is that all of these views are right to some degree or another. Every one of them has a grain of truth. And it's sort of silly to produce the kinds of dichotomies that we find in the literature, such that you're either one or the other. I think they're all right in different domains. Some are more likely than others. I don't think Chomsky's universal grammar is as strong a hypothesis as many people do, but there are certainly aspects of language that are universal. Now, numerical cognition. One of the first things I've claimed about the Piraha is that they don't have numbers and they don't count. And that's been criticized by a number of people. So people ask me things like, you mean mothers don't know how many children they have? No, they don't. They don't know if it's 3 or 4, but they know all their children's names, and they won't go any place without them. So they don't miss their children. They don't lose their children. I mean, they miss their children in one sense, and they don't miss them in another. They don't lose their children. If somebody brings in fish, you mean he doesn't know whether he has 4 fish or 5 fish? No, he doesn't, and it wouldn't have any usefulness to him to know. So how could you show that people don't have number? Well, first of all, you can say that in 30 years of looking for numbers, they don't have any. There was something that I thought meant 1, hue, and something that I thought meant 2, hue. You hear the difference? Hue, hue. And then something that I thought meant many, bagiso. But the thing that means 1 actually is, you can say that a baby, a male baby, for example, is a man, hue. And you can say that a female baby is a woman, hue. And you can say that I want one fish, what I thought was one fish, but it just means little fish. And what I thought meant two means more. So how do we test this? This caused a lot of controversy. So a group of MIT psychologists flew down with me to the Amazon in January of 2007, and they wanted to test them. So we did a series of experiments, and one of the things we noticed is that when the pitaha count upwards, everybody, so that's the top graph, the black, everyone used hue for one object. And everyone used hue for two objects. Okay, so is one, is two. And then with the number 3, we started to get a breakdown. Some would use hue, and some would use bagiso. And so we get asystematic results from that point on. Okay, so well, at least it seems that 1 and 2 are set, right? But not really, because now we ask them to count backwards. In other words, we start with 10 objects and we start taking them away. And we asked them to name what they got. So in the first set, we gave them 1 object and asked them what it was called, then gave them 2 and asked them what it was called, and gave them 3 all the way up to 10. But in the next test, we started with 10 and started taking them away. And here the breakdown comes a lot faster. So for 10, we got some people saying hue, which I thought meant 2, and many other people saying bagiso, and 9 and 8 and 7. But when we got to 6, some people were saying what I thought meant 1. What's going on here? Why do they switch to 1? And then by the time we get down to 3, it's all 1. Whereas in the top column, nobody used what I thought meant 1 for 3. Because they're relative quantities. When you start off with 10, small appears a lot faster when you're taking things away. But when you only start off with 1 and then add, you're increasing. So this was taken, and I think it's a good result, showing that these are not number words at all. These are relative quantities. There's also no grammatical number. I didn't think this was that uncommon, but my colleague in the UK, Greville Corbett, who's published a book called Number, which is about grammatical number, says that the pitaha speak the only language known without grammatical numbers. So this first word, pitaha people, evil spirit, fear. The pitaha are afraid of evil spirits, or a pitaha is afraid of an evil spirit, or the pitaha are afraid of an evil spirit, or a pitaha is afraid of evil spirits. It can mean any of those things. They just don't mark the distinction. So number doesn't play a role either in the grammar or in the counting system. So syntactic complexity is the next issue. And this is something that's really caused a lot of controversy. So I'll give you a quote from Borges. The world of appearances is complicated, and language has only verbalized a minuscule part of its potential, indefatigable combinations. Why not create a word, only one, for the converging perception of the cowbells announcing day's end and the sunset in the distance? Like bread and love, language is shared with others. Carlos Fuentes. These are views of language that linguists don't tend to share. There's no romance in our linguistic view of language, and maybe we should put a little more back in. One of the things I claim that pitaha lacks is quantification. So it doesn't even have words for all, each, every, these kinds of things. And this astounds some people. The philosopher Donald Davidson said the first step towards becoming a human thinker is to develop quantifiers. So this can mean that all the pitaha went to bathe or went swimming, but it really means just the bigness of people. And it drives some people crazy when I say it means the bigness rather than all. Well, how do you test that? Let's see if I've got that. If I say, let me just give you an example. If I have a piece of meat in front of you, and you say, I want all of the meat, and I say, okay, and I cut off a section of the end and give it to you, did I give you all of the meat? No. How many think I gave you all of the meat? How many think I did not give you all of the meat? Okay. The pitaha would have raised their hands the opposite direction if raising hands meant the slightest to them. And the reason for that is it only means really the bulk of the meat. There's no precise sense in which it means all of the meat. So they would have said, no, I didn't give you the bulk of the meat if I had taken half of it. But if I still give you more than half, that's okay. That's not a lie. And that's one way we test. Those are called truth conditions. Under what conditions would you say that what happened was true? That what was claimed was true? And the truth conditions of these words don't meet the truth conditions of quantifiers as they're normally understood. So in that sense, Pitaha doesn't have quantifiers. And here's the claim that has really caused a lot of controversy: recursion. The ability, you see recursion in lots of things. If you hold a mirror up in the bathroom and get that whole bunch of mirrors that you see off in the distance, that's visual recursion. I played the guitar, and Jimi Hendrix made auditory or oral recursion an art form. It's called feedback. Okay, the amplifier picks up itself, picks up itself, picks up itself, picks up itself. Just keeps going on and on and on. Those are forms of recursion. Now, when I wrote in the article in which I originally claimed they didn't have recursion, I didn't expect it to be a big deal. I didn't know that Chomsky and a couple of others had just published an article saying that recursion is the essence of human language, and it's what no other species has, and without it you can't have a language. Well, that's wrong. But anyway, and they think I'm wrong. These are difficult issues to tease apart. It's not that easy, but it's also not impossible to make the case that a language lacks recursion. Let's give you two samples from a text. The jaguar pounced upon my dog, it died. Okay? There should be a period actually between abai pit and koi. This text was collected about 30 years ago. So these are two sentences. The next sentence, there the jaguar pounced on my dog, it killed him, it happened with respect to me. If you go through Pitaha texts, and there are several in the book that's coming out, not that it's not a linguistic book, it's a bedtime reading book. You should all go get that book. Anyway, but there are plenty of examples of Pitaha text and why the claim that there's no recursion makes sense and how you could have it. Actually, there's a really interesting mathematical result that's come out in the last couple of months by Jerry Hobbs, who's a computer scientist at Stanford, who has argued that putting two sentences together have the same semantics, whether you put one inside another or where you just say them side by side. It's still possible to interpret them as recursively. So if I say, I want the hammock, you sold me the hammock, that can have the same interpretation as I want the hammock, you sold me. Okay? It's just that it depends on where you place the recursion, in the brain or in language. And that's the big issue, and that's what has failed to be addressed in a lot of the literature complaining or arguing that language is always recursive. So what's the evidence that Pitaha doesn't have recursion, this ability to put one thing inside another in the language? Well, there are no embedded clauses. There's, in English, an example of recursion is, I said that you would come here tomorrow. That you would come here tomorrow is a sentence, and it's inside another sentence. I said that. Or, in a noun phrase, I can say John's brother's house. House is a noun inside the noun phrase brother's house, and brother's house is a noun phrase inside the noun phrase John's brother's house. You don't get these structures in Pitaha. No embedded clauses, no recursive possessor phrases, and we worked very hard in the experiments to try to get these. No recursive modification. I remember I got the Pitaha to say to me one time, 2 big red airplanes. Now that can be recursional, even though that doesn't have to be one adjective phrase inside another. It could just be a string of adjectives. But actually, as I looked through Pitaha sentences, discourses, I never found examples like this. So I asked the Pitaha, can I say this? Yeah. You say it. They wouldn't say it. Why did you say I can say it? You're paying. You can say whatever you want. You have to be very careful in linguistic fieldwork that you don't, just like in the law, that you don't ask leading questions, because you can get answers that satisfy you but are really not true. So I've never found naturally occurring examples of modifiers inside modifiers. I'll give you there are a lot of jokes built on recursion, right? So my dad's an old Indian fighter. Okay, he fights old Indians. Or he could just mean he's an old guy who fights Indians. That's based on recursion. Whether old occurs in one noun phrase or another, which both together form another one. Or old men and women. Who's old? Well, it could be both men and women are old, or just the men are old and the women are young. Old men and women. And that's based on recursion. Does old modify men and women, or does it just modify men? Exciting stuff, isn't it? I know that these can seem really arcane, but if the ability, Chomsky's claim, for example, that recursion underlies the creativity of language. What does he mean by the creativity of language? He means the fact that for any sentence in the English language, I can produce one longer than that. There is no upper bound on the length of any sentence. And there's no upper bound on the number of sentences of English. How many you can ask the question, although it really doesn't make much sense. How many words are there in English? Somebody might try to give some sense to that, but nobody can ask the question and expect to get an answer. How many sentences are there in English? Because the answer is there doesn't seem to be an upper limit on it. However, it has been shown by a number of mathematical linguists that the arguments that show language is infinite don't go through. There's really no mathematical argument that could show that a language is infinite. All we can ever show is the grammar of the language is infinite, the grammar that the linguist wrote, but not that the language itself is infinite. So what's the evidence that Pitaha doesn't have recursion? Well, there's a number of specific linguistic arguments that can be brought to bear on the fact that it doesn't have recursion. There's just no evidence for it in the language, and there's experimental evidence now to the contrary. But if it's true that the language lacks recursion, then languages can differ a lot more than we thought. And what is interesting about that, in the context of what we were talking about earlier in terms of thought versus language, is that I can show that the Pitaha think recursively. They put stories together in such a way that you get subtopics inside of larger topics. That's recursion. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Herb Simon argued that all information processing is recursive. When you open up your computer and go to a folder, what's inside the folder? Often another folder, and then another folder. We organize, that's recursion. We organize information recursively. We think recursively, but that doesn't mean that we have to have language recursively. So what language recursion? So what could keep recursion out of language? Well, if we're all more or less equally intelligent and we use recursion as a necessary part of thought, which has nothing really to do with language, then what could keep recursion out of language is culture. Recursion has an important function. It enables us, when we put one sentence inside another, we make a large sentence that's got more information than either one of those two together. And in complex societies, the compacting information is an important cultural tool. It's very important to us. But if in a society that's esoteric and doesn't need to talk about complicated subjects, and it can take its information more slowly. So, for example, when people listen to the Pitaha tell stories, they're shocked by how much repetition there is. That's a stylistic thing that the Pitaha find desirable. They love to repeat. So they'll say, he said, he said, he said, he said, he said, and get on with it. But that to them is interesting. They like. Also, it's useful because there's a lot of noise going on in the background. And if I keep repeating things, and even though there's a lot of people, there are kids crying and dogs barking and other things going on, you can still make out what I'm talking about. But they don't need recursion. They think recursively, but they don't need recursion in the language. And that is very difficult for the idea that recursion is the essence of human language. So here's one reply that was given. Chomsky said to me, both in correspondence and in public discussion, that the fact that one language lacks recursion, who cares? That's just one language that didn't lack it, that didn't have it. It's just a tool, and language chose it or not. But just think about it. If recursion is the essence of human language, and recursion doesn't appear in a language, in principle it doesn't have to appear in any language. So then you could have the case where the essence of human language doesn't have to appear in any language. I find that difficult to follow. Now, Pitaha lacks color words. Linguists don't care about this, but some anthropologists do. They can describe colors, so they can say miopayai. That's how they usually discuss black. The blood is dirty. They say red, blood-like. They say white, you can see through it, or you can see it well. Green, it's still immature. Ahwai saga, it's still immature. These are just descriptive expressions. They can talk about colors. They just don't have words for them. There's no need for the words. And when there's a need to talk about colors, they describe them in different ways that fit. One of the most interesting things about Piraha language to me is they don't have a lot of fixed expressions. They invent things. In fact, it's interesting that in a language that seems to lack recursion, it's very, very creative. So I got the word, I thought it was the word to smell once. I was walking past a fire and they were barbecuing something and I said, oh, that's how do I say smell? I made the sound for sniffing and everything, and they gave me a long phrase. And that phrase happened to mean, I found out later, it seemed really too long to mean smell. It meant the smoke is pleasant as it hits me in the nose right now as I walk by. That's a word form. That's a single word. There's a number of things that I've talked about in other publications about the influence of culture on the sound structure of Piraha, and I'm going to skip those now because there's not time for them, but there's just a couple of other interesting points. There are no creation myths in Piraha. They don't tell stories about the way the world used to be. Everything that they talk about, they either observed directly or it was told to them by someone who observed it directly. They have the simplest kinship system known. They have a term for generation above, no gender distinction. So there's no word for mother or father, there's just a word for parent. There's a word for sibling, and there's a word for child. The only gender distinction is my biological son and daughter. There are terms for those. There are no perfect tenses. You don't say, I had eaten when you had arrived. When you arrived. Perfect tenses are tenses that aren't based on reference to the moment of speech, but to some other moment. So when you arrived, that's respect to the moment that we're talking right now. But had eaten is with respect to when you arrived. And that is outside of immediate experience, and that's not the way they talk. And so they lack perfect tenses. This summarizes all the time words that the Piraha have. Another day, already, night, early morning, before sunrise, now, full moon, low water, sunset or sunrise. It literally means when the sun touches the ground. During the day, which means in the sun. Noon, when the sun's big. Day, which means fire. And high water. High water is a time of year. What unites all of these things, if I'm correct, is that declarative Piraha utterances contain only assertions related directly to the moment of speech, either experienced by the speaker or as witnessed by someone alive during the lifetime of the speaker. If that's correct, it means that culture controls language. And if that's correct, if culture actually not only controls language, but the grammar, the recursion that has been claimed to be the essence of grammar, then that's very difficult to reconcile with the idea that grammars are specified in the genes as opposed to being shaped as cultural tools by societies as they're needed. So, among the conclusions, we're left with the question, how much variation is possible in human language? What are the predictions of the tool hypothesis? What are the predictions of the innatist hypothesis? The innatist hypothesis doesn't predict the amount of variation that we find in the world's languages. Piraha is just one. People have asked me, why don't other languages show this kind of variation? Well, part of it is because we don't look for them. We've been told it doesn't exist, so we ask questions that are answered in the theory that we have used the most. Here's an experiment trying to show recursion, just to give you some idea of the way we... Okay, so we were trying to get him to use a relative clause. I mean, I knew he wouldn't produce a relative clause, but the people from MIT who are sitting in the background wanted to see if he'd produce a relative clause. So I gave him a little doll, There's a guy. Yeah, there's a guy. Here's a guy. Yeah, there's a guy. This guy got bit by a jaguar. Yep, bit by a jaguar. Okay, so I take away the guy who was bitten by a jaguar, and I say, who was taken away? Who did I take? If there are relative clauses, he would have said the one who was bitten by a jaguar, which would have shown recursion. But he said the jaguar, meaning the guy who was taken away by the jaguar, that was bitten by the jaguar. So they have ways of talking around recursion, but all these experiments with 16 different people over a period of days showed not one single example of recursion. And those weren't the only tests that we used. We used a number of them. So my MIT colleagues were fairly convinced that the evidence is consistent with my proposal. They would never say it confirmed my proposal, because how can you confirm an argument from silence? If I claim that it doesn't have it, you can't prove that it doesn't have it. Okay? You can show that it's highly unlikely that it has it. It's like if your wife or girlfriend asks you if you were playing around. How do you prove that you weren't? It's very difficult. So don't put yourself in a situation where you're asked that question. So I'll stop now, and I guess we take a break, and then we see if people want to hang around and ask questions. Or
Questions? I want to take a few.
Sure, I can take questions if people have questions.
Turn to the microphone.
Push the bottom, I guess. I'm an expert on these now. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's on.
Okay. I enjoyed your talk. And so I don't want to seem ungrateful if I ask about something you didn't talk about.
Yeah.
But I am curious in the argument with Chomsky. One of the big canons is the poverty and stimulus arguments.
Oh, yeah.
So, could you say what your take is on that?
Yeah, I think that's wrong. I don't think the stimulus is impoverished. And there are a number of people who would agree with me. Chomsky calls this Plato's problem. How is it that children learn language exposed to so little data? That's the idea. This is an argument that I learned in my linguistic cradle. And it comes from Plato. So Chomsky calls it Plato's problem. Well, in my book that's currently in progress, in which I argue that language is not innate, I have a chapter called Aristotle's Answer, in which I argue that Aristotle recognized that Plato was wrong and that language emerges from culture, and he gave reasons for it. But Jeff Pullum and a number of other linguists and psychologists have argued at length that the claim that the environment doesn't have enough data. So here's the idea. The environment doesn't have enough data for any child to learn their language, and yet they do learn their language. So how do they do it in the absence of the data? It's in their heads when they're born. Okay, this is very similar to Socrates' questions. Socrates shows in Plato's dialogue Meno that we all know geometry by taking a little janitor boy, little clean-up boy, and showing that he knows geometry. But actually, the evidence seems to suggest that the poverty of stimulus argument is just wrong, that it's not too poor.
That there is enough stimulus?
That there is enough stimulus for children to actually learn their language. There's no paradox. There's no need to claim that they supply something from the genes.
I was wondering, you said there was a word for sibling, parent, child, biological son.
Biological daughter, yeah. Uh-huh.
So what would someone like you who's not in the family group be called then? Words for that.
A bint person. So the word for piraha, the piraha is not a piraha word. That's the name that Brazilians gave to them. They call themselves hiaiche, which means the straight ones. He is straight. They call us awe, which means bent. And that's what I am. I'm bent. They call their language apaicheso, straight head. They call our language apagaiso, crooked head. So they're fairly ethnocentric. Some of them, after a long period of time, call me ahage, which means sibling. But most of the time they don't. They just call me by my name, which is Pau Aise, which is the name of a really old man, because they say I am so old it looks like I'm going to fall, so old it looks like I'm going to fall, so old it looks like I'm going to fall, so old it looks like I'm going to fall, so old it looks like I'm going to fall, so old it looks like I'm going to fall, so old it looks down dead any minute. That's what they say. But they just normally call me Bent, as they would call you Bent.
I really enjoyed this. And one of the stories that's told to us who've learned about language is that, the glory of humanity is that all human beings, no matter what culture, have language, and languages are all more or less equal. And that's a story that's somehow confirming a certain values, us as human beings, or Western cultures. And what you just said earlier, that you found a kind of disconfirming example, an exception, a small tribe, a small exception, one that apparently Chomsky can more or less dismiss what he said to you. But you've also claimed, if I heard you right, that you haven't simply found a disconfirming example, you found a sort of pole on a continuum. That there are cultures that have language that has a lot of recursion embeddedness, a lot of counting and so forth, and this one that has none of each. And you suggested that there's a sort of a continuum between these.
Mm-hmm.
Question number one, is there evidence for that? Are you making that claim, and if so, is there evidence for that? And number two, if that's the case, what does that say about our humanity, about our oneness as human beings, about our capacities, differential capacities as human beings?
Okay, the evidence for that is first Piraha, second Australian languages that shows many Australian Aboriginal languages show characteristics similar. A famous linguist that was a colleague of Chomsky's many years ago, Ken Hale, argued that some languages of Australia were what he called non-configurational. They didn't put their sentences together the same way that we put ours together. And as I look at his data, I think Ken was actually saying that recursion is lacking in lots of places you expected to find it in these languages. But he didn't come out and say it that way, except in one footnote of an article that was published in an obscure place in the 70s that some people have pointed out to me, where he said, this language might not have any recursion. But he never made much of it. Ken was not, he was a very nice person, not very argumentative. He died a couple of years ago. But I'm not particularly nice, or do I mind to argue with people. So it seems to me that the Australian languages really do show another point on the continuum. They certainly have things Piraha lacks, but they seem to have other characteristics that Piraha has that make them different. So I think, and so if we look for these things, how can we reinterpret some of the data? Because everyone knows that when you write a grammar of a language, you didn't describe everything. There were a lot of things you didn't observe, and there were a lot of other things that didn't fit. You didn't lie about them, but you just didn't talk about them because you didn't know how to talk about them. And I think that a lot of the absence of recursion evidence is left out of the things because we just didn't know how to talk about it. Where does that leave us as human beings? Well, I think that there's a great amount of unity among humans. It's just not always where we thought it would be. I think that the cerebral cortex provides enough humanity and enough unification of human beings. We think we have similar cognitive capabilities. But notice that if I'm correct, if languages really do differ like this, then another hypothesis that linguists hold dear is gone. That is, it is not possible to translate from one language to all other languages. There are some things that you can't say from one language to another. Yeah.
I was wondering, with the people that live from the land and in a region of such extreme biodiversity in terms of the animals and plants and insects, and that probably being very necessary to food and sustenance,
Mm-hmm.
do they have an incredibly rich vocabulary, like words to name their plants and animals, or do they have some pool that they choose from and they're able to describe things differently? And then, as you said, they're very inventive, but how can they communicate, this plant's poisonous, this plant is good to eat, in a consistent way?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, when I walk with the Pitaha out into the jungle, I'm usually asking them the name of plants. It doesn't do me much good because I'm not a botanist. I mean, I ask them that out of a sense of duty. They give me the answers. Every one is different. And then they ask me, what do you call it in your language? What's that? Tree? What's that? Tree? What's that? Tree? They're all trees. And they say, you don't know the difference between these things? No. Gosh, your language is really bad. It confirms the idea that they're... So every Pitaha child knows the name of what would be in their system the species of every plant, every bit of flora and fauna in their environment. They know not only their names, but they know how they work. They know how they grow. They know the behavior of every animal. We can be going along and see bubbles in the water, and they know if it's rocks underneath or whether it's a certain kind of fish. I remember one of my favorite stories that's somewhat on point with your question is we went to upriver a ways, my daughter and I and two Pitaha in my motorboat. And I said, what are we going to do? He said, we're going to kill an anaconda. And I said, really? And so we get to this bank, and he said, look down there. Can you see its hole? The Maisi River is green water. I mean, it's really hard to see below it. I said, and anacondas are green. I said, no, I don't see its hole. So he takes that long bow, and he shoves it down under the water, and he said, that's going to make it mad. And he said, do you see it? And I didn't see anything. And then suddenly I started seeing mud swirl around. And he stood up and fired 2 arrows, one right after another, into the water. And suddenly this smallish 10-foot anaconda comes flying out of the water with 2 arrows through the head. And he pulled it in and he said, let's go scare the women. So they interpret nature, and their ability to perceive nature in their environment far exceeds mine. It far exceeds mine. I'm a complete disabled person as far as they're concerned.
I saw something about a humming language in one of the slides you skipped over. I'm really curious.
Okay. The Pitaha can not only communicate using consonants and vowels, but they can whistle their language. So if I say, there is a paka, which is a large rodent over there, I can say, or I can whistle it. Except Pitaha whistling is ingressive. The air comes in instead of going out, which I can't do very well. And they can hum it. They can sing it, which I can't do very well. But they separate the tones and they have a different rhythm. Each one of these I call channels of discourse, and each one of them has a different cultural function. So humming is used for intimate relations, mothers and children, lovers, or it can be used to talk with your mouth full. Or it can be used to talk for privacy. Singing is used to communicate new information or dreams or encounters with spirits. Whistling is used for men only while they're hunting. So these all have different functions. And it has implications for the sound system of the language, showing that you can't even figure out how the sounds of the language work until you understand the culture. Yeah.
Oh, hello.
Hi.
I was wondering, given the difference of language, whether or not they're plagued by different kinds of metaphysical problems than what we would find in Western philosophical discourse. Are they bothered, by example, by the distinction between mind and body?
No, they don't draw... Well, I shouldn't say they don't draw such a distinction. They don't talk about it in those terms. They do know that... But they don't talk about life after death. They don't see that. They don't believe in that. They're not bothered by a lot of speculation. In fact, almost none, because of the fact that they talk about what they can experience directly. They have asked me things like, do Americans die? Because if you're as old as I am, they must not. they sometimes wonder after I get out of the water and my hair is different than it was before I got in. Is that the same person? Or is that a spirit now? So they, I've told people that the Pitaha probably wouldn't bat an eyelid if I turned into a jaguar and run around the village and then turned back into me. I'm a weird person. Well, who knows what I'm capable of? But these things don't seem to bother them.
Okay, well, thank you all. And we have punch and cookies over here. Please help yourself, and please talk to Dan and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you.